items in the pouch in front of you.
Have a safe and informative journey.
Hello, I'm Nathan Hartman, and this is Dreamfinders, a podcast about the creative culture of Disney theme parks. If you're a Disney Parks fan and a bit of a bookworm, it's highly likely you've run across this week's guest. Jeff Kurtti has made a career out of connecting people with Disney culture. You might know him as the author of such fan favorites as Since the World Began, The Art of Disneyland, and several dozen other Disney titles. But his writing is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to both his celebration of Disney and his own place inside its history. Jeff sat down with me to talk about answering fan mail for Imagineering, sitting in meetings with Micheal Eisner and Jeffery Katzenberg, as well as becoming both friends and the official Shermanologist to the great Sherman Brothers. All of that and more is coming right up on Dreamfinders. Jeff Kurtti, welcome to Dreamfinders. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, I appreciate being asked. It's always fun.
So, man, you've worked for Disney, you've written about Disney, you've done everything in between. You've got so much stuff, so much love for the company. Did you have a love for Disney growing up? Where did it all start for you?
I was taken as a 5 or 6 year old to see Mary Poppins' first run, and it broke my brain. And I'm told that I sat in complete silence for 2 hours and 20 minutes. And the first thing that I said after it was over was, "Can we see it again?" And it sort of started an understanding of who and what Disney was. Because, you know, when you're a kid, Walt Disney sounds sort of fantastical. It's not a name like you encounter at school or on TV or anything like that. And I had to have explained to me that Walt Disney was a person, and he was the same person who made Mickey Mouse. And I already loved Mickey Mouse, so that was a short trip to turning into sort of a proto-Disney nerd. I sort of consumed everything that was available to a kid in the late 1960s, and comic books and promotional magazines and the weekly Disney TV series and the new Walt Disney Productions films and the reissues that often came with them. So you would see Dean Jones in Snowball Express, followed by Cinderella. You know, that was sort of the double feature of the 1970s, was sort of that formula. So as I grew older, it got to be more consumption, more study, more, academic in a certain way. But I just wanted to keep learning and knowing and understanding more about what this whole sort of culture was about, the creations that it involved, and of course the man who was behind it.
You grew up in Seattle. Was your family a Disney Parks family at all? I guess you were closer to Disneyland, but did you make it out that way, or? In
childhood, Disney was a faraway dream. Disneyland was a destination. It wasn't a simple place to get to. So I think that I started asking to go to Disneyland when I was about, I want to say 7 or so. Finally, we made a family trip to Disneyland in 1971. So I would have been, I think, 9 when I first went to Disneyland. Then I went again in 1973, and then again, I think, in 76. My grandmother was very supportive of my Disney habit and encouraged me along this strange route. And so I think she was financially responsible for the several trips to Disneyland that happened sort of in the early and mid-70s. But I inherited a 1958 Sam McKim fun map of Disneyland that was on the wall of my room at my grandmother's house. And then, of course, when I went to the park the first time, I bought one of the orange Sam McKim maps And that was like a study guide, a dream, an exploration. I mean, I think a lot of your listeners will identify with simply looking at the fun map for sometimes it seemed like hours at a time. That was my connection with the park at that point. I got a subscription to a magazine when I was a kid called Disney News, and that was offered to Magic Kingdom Club members, which was a employee promotional group that Disneyland had put together for group sales and for corporate employees. So I got this magazine every quarter that had everything about Disneyland and what was being made at the studios and that sort of thing. So that was another area of sort of research and information consumption. But Disneyland certainly was the dream destination always during that time.
As a kid, were you much of a creative? You certainly were invested in learning about the creativity of Disney. Were you a writer as a child? What creative outlets interested you?
I always had an interest and an enjoyment in drawing. And, of course, so many people, even today, still think, oh, if you're going to work for Disney, you have to be able to draw. So I pursued art and I pursued design and drawing beginning in elementary school, trying to learn how to be an artist. Ultimately, I went to art school long enough, as I tell people, to realize that I kind of stunk at art. But it was the parts that I wasn't bad at that were actually valuable in the long run for me. I learned about techniques. I learned about art history. I learned about the tools of the trade. I learned about artists and how artists perceive and how they behave. It's ultimately been very valuable, particularly as a documentarian, and chronicling the creations of art and artists through my writing and documentary film work. So in the end, it was valuable, but it was not the direct pathway I think that I imagined it would be when I was a kid.
Yeah, because in 1984, you end up you finish college, and you end up working as, I guess they call it, a production coordinator for the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Arts Festival. And for people that don't know, according to the New York Times, the festival provided more than 400 performances by like 145 theater, dance, music companies that represented every continent and 18 countries specifically. You know, I find this interesting in the sense that it comes sort of in the same time frame as Epcot and World Showcase. It has a little bit of that vibe, that sort of connecting the world through art and their histories and that sort of thing. What was your involvement in this arts festival, and what did you sort of take from it?
Well, it's interesting because in supporting myself to go to art school, I wound up working in Seattle in two large theaters. The Fifth Avenue and the Paramount. So I was getting all of this experience with, in one theater, I was working for the general management office and doing sort of jack of all trades stuff nobody else wanted to do, but I was exposed to all this amazing theater during the course of sort of the last great days of national tours. So we had everything come through there, from A Chorus Line to Annie to Pirates of Penzance, and stars from every medium, from every area of theatrical and television and performing arts history. So I met a lot of great people and got a lot of experience that was sort of not Disney, but it was very non-specific. In situations like that, I was working in one theater, I was working in the publicity office, and I was writing press releases, and I was leading tours and doing all manner of public-facing representation. So when the Olympic Arts Festival gig came about, it was labeled as a production coordinator, but like many great giant events of that type, it was all hands on deck, and it was nature abhors a vacuum. So it was lots and lots of cases of somebody shouting out, who can do this thing? And you raise your hand. So that Olympics experience not only was an immersion in sort of a world of culture that was all sort of fascinating, one of a kind, once in a lifetime, but also meeting a lot of people from all over the world and meeting a lot of people working on the Olympic Arts Festival from all walks of production management and theatrical backgrounds that were simply putting on the event. So I don't think I could have designed a better training ground for that. Mm. The interesting notion about sort of a global culture and Epcot is accurate to the degree, but the more important connection for me was that once the Olympics ended, there were thousands of people who were out of work. Mm. And over across town in Burbank, there was a movie studio that had new leadership. Disney had been taken over by Michael Eisner and Frank Wells, and they were actually staffing up. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people made the short jump from Marina del Rey, where the Olympic headquarters were, over to Burbank, and suddenly a lot of those ex-Olympic colleagues were over working for the newly expanding Walt Disney studio, Walt Disney Productions at the time. So that was yet another sort of fortunate transition, both in experience and in timing, more than anything else. So doing a project like the Olympics is a lot like being in the Army. Mm. Because you make friends there that are your friends for the rest of your life simply because you've been through it together. And I still have friends today. And there's some of us having a conversation right now about, hey, the Olympics are coming back to Los Angeles in 2028. Wouldn't it be great to have like our first really big job and now to have it be our last really big job at sort of the tail end of our career? That would be really fun.
Yeah.
But what it did was it created a more direct pathway into a new and different Walt Disney Productions at the time. And that in sort of shorthand form is what happened to me.
Yeah, because you ended up, by 87, a couple years later, you were in Imagineering as a senior communications specialist. Sort of, it seems, doing a little bit of what you had done before, some press stuff, but you were a liaison for press events. And, you really find yourself, in a way, the troubadour, as it were, one of the troubadours, sort of telling all of the Eisner era or what was to come. He had just gotten there a few years before, and things are starting to pick up, especially once you kind of move into 91. Is there anything particular about this time that sticks out to you about your position in Imagineering, the environment, or a press event that was particularly special?
Well, culturally, it was an amazing time at Disney, and fortunately, far from what I think people feared at the time, that Michael and Frank came over from other studios, Michael from Paramount and Frank from Warner Brothers, that they wouldn't get the very special nature of the Disney culture. Mm. So we had a lot of young people at the time, and a lot of people who were somewhat embedded already at Walt Disney Imagineering and around the company, who really acted as sort of cultural liaisons in a certain way, especially with so many new people coming in. Mm. There were a lot of people who either were or became cultural ambassadors to the company at large in certain ways. That was a lot of what my job in communications at WDI was. I had a really amazing boss there who was extraordinarily encouraging. She was very much like an Auntie Mame character. Her name was Betsy Richmond. She was one of those great bosses you get every now and then who sees your potential and sort of lets you fly. Mm. And that led me to be very much involved with a lot of the old guys. So I would walk down the corridors at WDI and be working with Claude Coates or Sam McKim. Herbie Ryman was in the cubicle next to me when I first started Imagineering. Mm. And, of course, that led to getting some great guidance and mentorship from Marty Sklar. Mm. And Marty, to a large degree, put me out there. Now, what that communications job did, too, was it put me out to all of the various press and media within the company. So I would go and represent Imagineering at attraction openings, press events, and so on, and would be one of those crazy people who would get up at 4 a.m. to do drive time East Coast interviews. Back in the old days when they did live radio broadcasts with press events all the time. But it just, once again, it continued to introduce me to a wider and wider swath of Disney people all around the company. And that's ultimately what led my going from Walt Disney Imagineering over to a larger and broader, but similar function in a department called Corporate Synergy and Special Projects. And that happened about 1990, I think.
One position or part of your job in Imagineering was guest letters. What sort of mail does Imagineering get? I'm curious.
In the communications office at Imagineering, you deal with all manner of communications. And that includes, giving tours to VIP visitors. That includes interconnections with all the various business units of the Disney company when they need an Imagineering something answered, found, helped with. And of course, one of those things was I would get guest letters, both things that had come directly to WDI, which were fairly few, actually, but the ones that would get forwarded from Disneyland. And they ran the gamut. The things you might expect were very interesting. People who wanted to, I just want to work for Disney. And of course, those really touched me. And I was very careful about how I answered letters from people who expressed an interest in a Disney career and what do I do and how do I do that. So those were, I think that was probably about half the letters that I would answer. The other guest letters typically took the form of complaints. And they were complaints about attraction quality or content. Some of them were very easy to answer. I remember one very lengthy letter that complained about how we had ruined Pirates of the Caribbean. And the letter came right after one of the first major complete shutdown rehabs that they had done at Pirates. This would have been probably about 89 or so, where they had shut the attraction completely down. They had replaced all of the ceiling areas. They had gotten all of the waterfalls in the grottos, in the skeleton grottos, working for the first time in about 8 or 10 years. All the waterfalls and water elements worked in there. They did a whole complete relighting pass, et cetera, et cetera. So I was able to confidently write back to this person and say, I'm sorry if all of these improvements, upgrades, and enhancements ruined your experience in my snarky, passive-aggressive way. I remember one was somebody complaining that they had taken their 3-year-old on Snow White's Scary Adventures, and it was too frightening. And you had to sort of write that letter back that in a very not nasty way said, did you notice the word scary in the on the marquee etched into stone? Then there were odd ones too. I had one from a Christian fundamentalist who was very earnest and very sincere about the portrayal of the devil in Mr. Toad's Wild Ride and hell. And in my beliefs, hell is a very real place and so on. So I really had to sort of deconstruct and put back in front of her that hell is a natural result of bad behavior, and Mr. Toad behaves badly, and therefore that's where he winds up. So that was always interesting. It could be frustrating at times. It could be very challenging at times because you don't want to negate people's opinions, feelings, ideas who have actually taken the time and effort to reach out and correspond. It's very hard sometimes, from a corporate standpoint, because you have to do a certain amount of towing the corporate line, and that can disappoint people who write in sometimes because you sort of have to tell them what you're supposed to tell them and not be too encouraging and not be too open. I got some very good advice, though, because over the years, answering guest letters, I got into some correspondence with a couple of young people, young teen. I was in my 20s. These were probably 15, 16-year-olds. And I asked my boss, I've got a couple people who keep writing back to me. And I said, I don't know if I'm supposed to engage in a correspondence. Hmm. And she said, you should ask Dave Smith if he has sort of a rule of thumb, because he gets that all the time. So I called Dave, and he said, I just have a rule that if they want to talk about ideas, that's a wonderful thing to be able to feel like you have somebody you can talk to at Disney. If they start to ask about things or want things, then I end the correspondence. Hmm. I thought that was a pretty basic, Ideas are free, but if you just want stuff, this isn't the way to go about it.
I'm curious if your office, I know at some point at Epcot in Communicore, there was the ability to ask a question about anything at Disney, and then someone would get back to you. Do you remember if that came through your department, or was that somewhere else?
A lot of that stuff came through. A lot of the stuff that came through Communicore was really specific to Epcot attractions, though. They would handle larger and sort of more global company things and that sort of stuff. But a lot of those questions from Communicore had to do with, who was the designer, or how does that piece of technology work, or is that the same as that? And they were very specific to what Imagineering does. So, yeah, I remember those.
So you end up in a senior marketing rep position for Disney as a whole, in a time that is, what they kind of consider the beginning of the Disney decade. Eisner's pushed things like Euro Disney and MGM, and things are pretty booming. Motion pictures, Touchstone, things are starting to really take off. For you, what was that environment like? Were you given some of these big goals to sort of find a way to tackle and present to other people?
Basically, we were a department that was set up and reported to Michael Eisner. And he had a very accurate understanding that a part of what made Disney work so well is that all of its component businesses could actually cross-utilize and cross-promote. It was something that Walt had set up decades before, so that the entire company could, given the proper project or the proper initiative, could all speak with one unified voice. It was very smart, and it's something that they still engage in. I don't think it's to the level of sophistication and the level of involvement that we did when I was in that department. In many ways, because the company is so much bigger now, and it's much more difficult to, herd that particular group of kittens into one unified group. But, for instance, we would look for, suggest, and put out various initiatives. We worked with a committee that was comprised of representatives from the business units around the company. So we would have a meeting about once a month and do updates and discussions and brainstormings and so on. But typically each year had a very large thematic, whether it was Mickey's 60th birthday or the opening of Disneyland Paris, where we would say, yes, that is what this company is about for this calendar year. And then what our department would do would be to work with all the various business units to create initiatives, cross-promotions, and opportunities for all the businesses to have a voice in that large theme or in any of the subsidiary projects that came about due to that, or any of the secondary elements. A lot of times, it was anniversaries or big movie releases and so on that would also have this sort of same approach of looking company-wide at where those engagements can happen, where, 1 + 1 = 4, because there's so much in the zeitgeist of the entire company going on. So that was really what our job was. And it was very exciting. It was very, in many ways, it was very much the training that came out of my experience in the theaters when I was in Seattle. It came out of the Olympic Arts Festival. It was that sense of event and all hands on deck. I had an Imagineering executive tell me once that it was suited to my personality because I'm not very good at long-term management. I get very bored with sort of managing the same thing, doing the same functions over and over again, and that I'm much more attuned to the creation of something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then doing that over again, which is sort of what my career has done ever since.
Is there something about your time during this portion of your career working in proximity to Michael Eisner? Is there anything that stuck out to you about his leadership style or his management style, the creativity about it, that you sort of remember?
What I remember most about Michael is that he got the Disney culture. And when I say that he got it, I think in many ways he didn't know how it worked, but he knew it was a thing and that it was really important and that it was really valuable to the company. He didn't dismiss history offhand as something that was old, done, and over with. He understood that history and legacy are two different animals. History is data-driven and it's very statistical, and legacy is how you utilize the past to leverage more in the future. And I think he just really understood that. But here I was, what was I, 31 years old going into this corporate role. And I'm sitting at conference tables with Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg and occasionally, Frank Wells. But, I'm on the studio lot and walking around, and it's a very active studio with lots of stuff going on. And, we've got Carol Burnett in one sound stage and Bette Midler over there, and Tim Allen is shooting Home Improvement over there. And, there's part of a time when you're in the middle of stuff like that, it might sort of wash over you and you take it for granted. But I still remember sitting in conference tables and looking across at Michael and Jeffrey Katzenberg and this sort of little 6-year-old inside of me going, what in heaven's name is going on here? This is, and it was fun to, have Jeffrey Katzenberg pick on you because you're a nerd at a conference table. I still remember one meeting. Can't remember what the meeting was about, but the question came up about international film releases and the regionalization of Disney titles. So, they would release an animated feature and they would do regionalizations, which meant that they would re-record all of the audio elements so that they were very specific to different areas of the world. And Jeffrey at one meeting, or Michael, said something about, well, how long have we been doing that? And Katzenberg looked over at me and said, Jeff? And I said, I think the first regionalization was in 1930 for shorts. So we began regionalizing the shorts, and I think it was Mickey's Follies. I think that sticks in my head. I don't remember why, but and I may be wrong. But I piped up with an answer, and Eisner just looked at me and said, how do you know this stuff? So, lots and lots of really great memories now. Lots of people I met who I didn't even think at the time it was a big deal. And I look back and I'm like, gee, that was really a big deal.
At sort of the end of your tenure with Disney in this way, sadly, in 94, Frank Wells, who was president at the time, passes away tragically in a helicopter accident. Do you remember that day? It seems like a very pinnacle moment in sort of the Eisner era. What are your memories of the atmosphere?
I remember the day my phone rang at home. I think it was a Sunday. And it was my boss from Corporate Synergy, and she said, I need you in the office. I'm headed up there. And I said, what's going on? She said, Frank was killed. And time stopped. Because Frank was vital. He was energetic. He was an athlete. He was a thinker. He was a sort of a sizzling intellectual and a very present when he was in a room. He was also a core of energy for the studio, and he was the great balance for Micheal. They had intentionally created a very superb Walt and Roy with Micheal and Frank. It was shocking. It was unbelievable. But I remember we all gathered, went over, and were at the studio office. And the last major project that I really have any memory of participating in was Frank's memorial service on the studio lot. And I think we wound up in both of the big sound stages. And everyone was there. I mean, absolutely. He was so well loved. He was so respected in the industry. And I mean, everyone was there. I remember walking from the Alameda Gate with one of my colleagues escorting Robert Redford, who was so completely shaken up and so at a loss. He was a mess. He was so destroyed by Frank's death. They were very good friends, and they did a lot of skiing together. And it was truly, I mean, it sounds very corny, it was truly the end of an era. Because Micheal was never the same after that. He lost his guide rail. And I think you see just in terms of history, kind of where he bumped off the curbs for the rest of his Disney career to a certain degree. Frank was his beacon. Frank was the guy who really guided the way for the ideas and very often the craziness that Micheal would get excited about. And he would be this guy who sort of packaged it back into some form of consumable reality. And then suddenly Micheal didn't have that anymore.
So we find you, as you mentioned earlier, you get kind of tired of certain things and want to try something new. And by 96, you are the author of Since the World Began, Walt Disney World, First 25 Years, a book that I would say, has really stood the test of time. I remember telling people I had the opportunity to interview you, and they said, "Oh yeah, Since the World Began, it's a classic." People really connect, I think, with this book, a certain generation, the way you connected with the maps from your childhood. How did you get tasked with that book, and what inspired you while you were working on it?
Towards the end of my Disney career, I realized that I had hit a ceiling in the sense that there was so much that I felt I wanted to do. And unfortunately, I was in a role at the company that is global and as manifold as the responsibilities and tasks were, that I really wasn't growing anywhere. And I went to my boss at the time, who was vice president under Micheal, and she was an incredibly generous woman named Jody Dreyer. And Jody and I sat and sort of figured it out. What was missing? What did I need? What did I want? And we were a bit stumped for a while, and she finally suggested that I leave. Her reasoning was very sound. She said, "You know everyone, and you have a really good reputation. And I know that," and at the time I was already doing consulting work that fell outside the boundaries of my day-to-day job. So at the time I was already writing quarterly marketing scripts for the Disney Channel. Back then the Disney Channel was a premium channel, and every quarter they turned it on for a weekend for free, so they could show people what they would get if they bought the Disney Channel as a premium. So they would have guest hosts do wraparounds and intros to everything, and I was writing a lot of those for, Robbie Benson and Shelley Duvall and a lot of different people who did those quarterly marketing pieces, and they were very well paid. Her encouragement was, "Go away, and if it doesn't work out, come back and we'll figure out someplace for you back in the company." Back in those days, it was still a lot of the family feeling of the Disney company was still intact. I think it's probably much less so today, now 20 odd years later. But at that time there was still a sense of you can come back to the fold. I think it was the confidence of that encouragement that I left and continued doing Disney Channel and immediately picked up 3 or 4 clients doing more writing. And one of the people that I had worked with in Corporate Synergy, who remains today my dear friend and editor, is Wendy Lefcon at Disney Editions. And Wendy approached me about Since the World Began. And what do you say except yes? I mean, what a dream come true. And it was scary because nobody had ever written a history of Walt Disney World before. But then they told me that the book designer, for instance, would be a design legend named Nei Chang. Nei Chang designed the original Christopher Finch Art of Walt Disney. Nei Chang essentially created the coffee table book back in the 70s. And he was going to be the designer of this Since the World Began book. So I sort of swallowed hard and dove in and started doing the research and working it all out. And ultimately, we were very pleased with the result. It was interesting because for the first time, we were allowed to talk about things within that book that didn't get talked about a lot, like the property acquisition and the development and formation of Reedy Creek and all of those sorts of things. Now it's sort of quaint in a sense because it's so out of date. I mean, it's 25 years ago. But I have had more people, I think, come up to me and say this was an important book than just about anything I've done in my whole career. Makes me feel really old when I have, some 20-something come up and say, I got that book when I was 7. And I, immediately want to get out my cane. And
we are approaching the 50th, so.
Exactly. So that started a good relationship with both Wendy Lefcon at Disney Editions and with my relationship with understanding how to do a Disney book. And, of course, since then it's gone on 20, 25 years doing books for Disney, more than 30 of them now. But it also led in other directions because of the documentary nature of these books and how they're created. It led to other documentarian functions. It increased and constantly increases, never-endingly increases my sense of Disney scholarship. I'm confronted a lot these days with people who set up a blog and want to be Disney historians without having engaged in the actual work of becoming one. And it's a little frustrating sometimes. The vox populi of the internet creates lots and lots of experts who probably shouldn't consider themselves experts. But working on the books led me to working on documentary and supplement material for Disney Home Video, for Disney DVD, for creating the Walt Disney Family Museum, for producing documentary films, and working as a researcher and consultant all across the company still to this very day. Jody Dreyer was right. Leaving is sometimes the best thing you can do to create a better relationship in this particular sense. And it frees you to be afraid, and it frees you to be challenged, and it frees you to do things you never thought you could do.
What's one of those things you didn't think you'd be able to do and you found yourself doing it?
It's so interesting because that would be everything. I had no idea how to DVD edition and all of its supplement. I had no idea how to direct an on-camera interview. And once again, I began to realize that John Steinbeck didn't know how to write a book until he sat down and wrote a book. Charlie Chaplin didn't know how to make a movie until he went and made a movie. And in my own little nerdy, narrow Disney way, I didn't know how to do those things, but I had the component elements and the fundamental skills to be able to figure it out. And I also had what I hope is a humility and an ability to learn and listen that led me in the right direction on learning how to do all of those things. It continues today. I'm standing, you know what, and a lot of it had to do with back on the Olympics, when you would be in a room and somebody would say, I need somebody to do that, and you would raise your hand. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to figure out how to do it. And that still goes on to this day, where I'll be asked, can you develop a proposal for this project and put together a pitch deck that I can take to finance? And you say, sure. And then you hang up the phone and you call somebody who's smarter than you are and say, how do I do this? Yeah. I think that's the trick to a lot of things when you develop into a career is it's not about knowing everything. In many ways, it's more about knowing where to find everything. It's not about knowing how to do things. It's about knowing who you know who might know better how to do things. It's not about being the smartest guy in the room. It's about knowing the smartest guys and being able to call on them and say, you're better at this than I am. Can you help me out? Do you want to come on this project? It's that kind of what I would think of as more professional. It's sort of a humble professional strategy in a certain way. I think a lot of people get wrapped around their own axle because they think they can do everything. And I think that that's the danger that you get into. I've luckily been able to succeed in a polymath way because I know one of the great lessons I ever learned. I had a production company when we were doing DVD supplement material, and I was a co-owner of it. And one day I was sitting in an office in Hollywood, punching a clock, had to be in my office because I was needed. And I was there till too late at night, too many nights. And I'm sitting in an office looking at group insurance policies for 25 employees. And I had that light bulb go on where I thought, what in the heck am I doing? And that was where I got one of the great career mottos of all time, which is do what you do and don't do what you don't. And I realized I was sitting in a desk and doing things that I don't do. I don't do administration. I don't run an organization. That's what I hire smarter people who are better at it to do. Can I do it? Sure I can. I can do anything. I can mow my own lawn, but I'd rather pay a guy who does a really great job. So that's been sort of a guiding light for me and a principle for me. I'm not good at office hours. I'm not good at the restraint of office culture that's required. I tend to speak my mind very frankly, and a lot of times that doesn't go over well politically. So I've found this way to function as a consultant and a content person where I avoid the pitfalls of and traps of doing what I don't do.
Well, what you do is a lot, and you mentioned those before. You worked on DVD supplements. You were the creative director for the Walt Disney Family Museum. Several books that people have heard of, Imagineering Legends, and on and on and on. One of the things I really love, one of the projects you were a part of, was in 2009. You were the producer of The Boys. It was the Sherman Brothers story. It's a really moving documentary that I don't think enough people have seen. And in many ways, you sort of bring those famous brothers back together a bit. What was that process like for you, both as a fan and as a producer?
I had known the Sherman Brothers since my youth, in the sense that I had 3 albums that I played ceaselessly for years. The soundtrack of Mary Poppins, the soundtrack of Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and the soundtrack of Tom Sawyer. And I think it took me several years, because I was a kid and, not especially bright, to realize that why I liked these so much was the music was by the same guys. Skip ahead to 1986. I'm in my first job at Disney. Our office is in the old animation building on the studio lot. I was walking out in from the parking lot on Buena Vista Street, and walking toward me were the Sherman Brothers. And I looked at them, and my eyes went wide, and I felt my heart racing. These guys were my heroes. I loved their music, and I had studied as much as I could about who they were and what they did, and I walked up to them and said, "Oh my gosh, you guys are the Sherman Brothers." Well, Dick and Bob were not used to being recognized, especially by a punk kid of 24 at the time, I think, or 25. And we stood there for half an hour in the studio parking lot talking about, I told them how much I admired them and how much I enjoyed. And they were used to, I'm sure, a certain degree of, oh, I love Mary Poppins, or Feed the Birds is my favorite song. I wanted to talk to them. At that point, I had just watched Tom Sawyer again, and I knew that they had written the screenplay as well as the score. So I talked to them about how they approached the screenwriting. And Bob in particular was very interested that I was interested in something a little off the beaten path with them. They were sweet. They were wonderful. I thanked them for letting me interrupt their walk to the car. About 2 weeks later, I was walking into Walt Disney Imagineering over in Glendale, and walking out the front door, I'm not making this up, Dick and Bob Sherman. "Hey, there's our friend, the Tom Sawyer guy." "Hi, Jeff." "Yeah, Jeff. Hey, blah, blah, blah." We talk again, half an hour in front of Walt Disney Imagineering. And this time, Dick gave me their business card and said, "Why don't you give us a call and come over and visit in our studio? And we can, maybe come over in the afternoon, and we'll have a little something to drink and talk some more." From that point on, I was in a position to not only have access to Dick and Bob, got to know them and their wives and their families over the next several years, but I was also in a position to put them into things as part of the company legacy. At that time in the late 80s, they were considered sort of old hat. Ashman and Menken were the new, the hip, the groovy. These old guys, they're from the 60s. I got an ability to reintroduce them during that period in the late 80s and early 90s when I worked in communications at WDI and then in corporate, by having them come to press events and highlighting their career in employee newsletters and in the Disney News magazine and so on, sort of bringing them back into the Disney culture in a way that repositioned them as legacy. And that's one of my proudest achievements, was sort of taking care of that over and over again and plugging them into people and projects that could continue to celebrate what they brought to the Disney culture. Several years, Dick and Bob and I discussed a book that they had developed and could not get any interest in, called Walt's Time, which was a story of their time at the Disney company. Publishers then were only interested in salacious tell-alls. They wanted to know about what a horrible person Walt Disney was and what a terrible place it was. And that was sort of the leering publishing philosophy of that era, that we wanted to knock down our idols. Instead, we developed Walt's Time into a self-published professional biographical scrapbook that we published in, that would have been 96, 97, I think. That finally came to pass. So when the Making of the Boys came about, it was fairly natural for Dick and Bob. Bob had already dubbed me the official Shermanologist. I got to be a Sherman word, which is the achievement of my entire career. Is the Sherman Brothers dubbed me with a Sherman word. So I am a Shermanologist. And they brought me in to work with Bob's son Jeff and Dick's son Greg, who were co-directing the film, and said, "He knows more than you do. He knows more than we do." And really that, once again, has to do with what a lot of a historian does and a lot of what a researcher and scholar does, is its context. Because you can place them into an overall scene rather than the specificity of what they witnessed and what they did and what they know. The other thing was, I had done so much work on the DVD supplements and home video work that I knew where everything was. I was over at Jeff Sherman's house just this last weekend, actually, and he was talking to a friend of his, and he said, the thing I loved about working on The Boys with Jeff was every day was a little surprise. Because we would listen to interviews or we would look at rough cuts, and I would scurry away and think about them. This example that Jeff used was, it was always, there was a piece of art, there was a photograph, there was something that related directly to what we were doing and what we needed. Jeff said, I remember one specific day, Jeff came in, handed us a DVD, we put it in, and we were just cutting together a piece about the meaning of Feed the Birds. And Jeff handed us footage of Walt Disney feeding birds. And he said we were just awestruck. Well, of course, that's what I do. Doing all the documentaries and videos and stuff, it just struck me, hey, you know what? There's a short film from 1952 called The Peter Pan Story, and there's black and white footage of Walt Disney in Kensington Park feeding birds. That would go really great there. So that was a lot of what I brought to The Boys, was understanding the material deeply and providing a richness for the visuals. I knew a lot of the people who had touched their lives, so in terms of reaching out to draw people in to do interviews, I was already in touch with a lot of those people and was able to facilitate that and suggest people that maybe Jeff and Greg hadn't thought of. And I was able to cast a balanced eye over what was really a personal story at the end. I was able to help them with the fundamentals of the statistical and historical, but I was also able to help guide them with what I had perceived in watching Dick and Bob's relationship together for as long as I had. They each had an observation that came from their individual observation of their own father, which is very different. And in many ways, it's a perspective that led to a lot of what I did with Diane Disney Miller on the Walt Disney Family Museum.
So you've written several books since, of course, The Boys. 2018, a very big year for Jeff Kurtti, 2018, I would say. Recently, what has just come out is Travels with Walt Disney, Photographic Voyage Around the World. Tell us a little bit about this real treasure.
Of course, working on the Walt Disney Family Museum, one thing that I now know very, very well is the photographic record and the film record and the audio record, the media record of Walt Disney. I was asked to go on a Disney cruise and to present lectures and to sign books and connect with guests and talk to them about Disney culture and history. And I've done this for many years. It's a wonderful thing. I love doing it. They asked me to put a program, a new original program together for the Disney cruise. So I put something together called Walt Disney on the High Seas. And it was really about Walt's relationship with the sea. And at first I thought it would be, a couple of the cruise ship things that I had seen while we were doing the museum. And then Disney-themed nautical stuff. The Columbia sailing ship and boat builders. And I could sew something together that had sort of a cruise line theme to it. Of course, as I began to put all the pieces together and look at it in a linear way, I realized Walt did a lot of cruising. He was on cruise ships a lot. And it became a very interesting presentation about Walt Disney's ocean travels. At the end of one of the presentations, one of the guests came up to me and said, I would love to go into the gift shop on board this cruise ship and get a little book that has all those terrific photos and all of those anecdotes about where he traveled, why he traveled, how he traveled. I made a PDF out of my keynote and sent it to Wendy Lefkon at Disney Editions and said, is there a book here? And she said, yes, but I don't think it's the book you're thinking of. I think you should broaden this out. Walt was a traveler his whole life, not just a cruise ship passenger. He was a traveler. And Wendy's inspiration was, why don't you do a travel journal? Well, of course, there's an abundance of photography of Walt in transit and on locations all over the place. and all over the arc of his life. So then working with Wendy Lefkon and with my other editor, Jennifer Eastwood, we sort of put our collective heads together, and it became Travels with Walt Disney. And what's interesting is, of course, with the perspective that I have and the work that I've done, nothing is new anymore to me. So I don't have a really great awareness sometimes of the rarity of the photographs and images that I put in front of people. But I had somebody who wrote a review who said that there are 198 photos in Travels with Walt Disney, of which I have not seen 115. So we got to put a lot of fresh perspectives on Walt in front of new audiences. This is part of what I have to remember when I write books, too, for Disney audiences. What's a Disney audience? Well, I have to write it for a 15-year-old who is just learning and doesn't know the mythology and doesn't know the chronology of Walt Disney's life and career the way that a 50-year-old Disney fan who's been doing it for years knows. So I have to make it authoritative and interesting enough for a real diehard Disney fan. I have to make it accessible and interesting enough for somebody who's a neophyte. And somewhere in the middle, I have to make it entertaining for anybody who picks it up. So it's a crazy kind of balance to have to come to in a lifetime of doing this. But I think that that's what I really strive for. And of course, at the end of the day, what I try to do is create a book that I would feel great about buying at cover price.
Also coming out, if not already out, because we record these a little early, is From All of Us to All of You, Disney Christmas Cards. What was your relationship with the holiday perspective of Disney, and what sort of did you pick up when you put all of it together and looked at it as a celebration of the season from Disney's perspective?
Once again, in looking to tell a Disney story, even if it's something that's somewhat historic, that feels like it should be chronological. That was one of the things about Travels with Walt Disney. I avoided being strictly chronological within it and tried to arrange the content in a way that was actually more interesting, that had more of a story to tell. So ultimately, that became a biographical essay about Walt Disney, why he traveled, where he traveled, and what he did there and on the way. In looking at the Disney Christmas card, I worked with a longtime friend. I actually just realized I dedicated Since the World Began to him many years ago, Paul Walsky. Paul and I went to the archives and did a first pass. Disney Christmas card was something I had pitched 9 years ago. And we had actually sold it, and then the economic downturn, so it must have been 10 years ago, 10 or 11. The economic downturn in the early aughts, they shelved the project and it died. So Paul and I went to the archives and simply started looking at the cards, trying to figure out if there was a suggestion of a story. In a way, we wound up in the middle telling a holiday story about Disney, because what I realized as somebody who's immersed in the culture of Disney is the Disney culture and the culture of Christmas have a great deal in common. The way that we experience them, the feelings we have about them both, and the way we pass on our traditions are very similar with Christmas and the season and with Disney. So that really became the overarching story of the Disney Christmas card book. Now, of course, within that story, you have the story of an incredible group of artists and the history of a studio also as part of the secondary and tertiary storylines within it. So I think people will find not only beautiful, gorgeous, much of it never before published Christmas art, Disney Christmas art, but there's also a storytelling too about artists and creation and the culture and history of Disney in general.
Well, finishing up here and talk about life circling back around on itself. You fell in love with Disney thanks to Mary Poppins, and now you have coming out practically Poppins in every way. which seems to be a celebration of the character and both the classic film and I'm assuming by the timing of the book's release, also the sequel. Getting into that project, was there something between your relationships with the Sherman Brothers and all of that? Was this a project that really excited you, and what sort of inspired the direction you took it?
Wendy Lafgon and I had been talking about doing a Mary Poppins book for 24 years, and we just never could arrive on anything. The other difficulty with the Mary Poppins stories or the Mary Poppins property in book form is there's a lot of people who have ownership. So you not only have the Travers estate, you also have the American publisher of the Travers originals, and you have Disney. So we never reached a book project that we felt sort of satisfied everything that everybody would get on board with. With the release of Rob Marshall's new Mary Poppins Returns, we had an opportunity, and Wendy said, "Do you want to do a Mary Poppins book?" And once again, a little 6-year-old me inside absolutely fell over. There's no answer except yes. What can we do? It was not easy. It was actually a struggle to figure out a way to put a Mary Poppins book together that's not really a making of book. It's not an art of book. And I submitted a proposal that everybody accepted, and I went to England and visited Shepperton Studios and the sets of Mary Poppins Returns and met a lot of the creative team there, and my outline did not work. The book outline there were two things going on. It was dull. It didn't have anything to say. It made the new film seem like the caboose to a much greater engine, and it absolutely challenged me. Then I had an inspiration at one point, and I can't remember exactly where it came from. But what I ultimately realized is that I needed to free myself and talk more globally about the appeal of Mary Poppins. We had always intended to do something of a book that was about the whole Mary Poppins idea, but structurally I was able to sort of blow up my outline and rearrange all of the content into a form that is much more thoughtful. And it really is about the nature of Mary Poppins. She arrives unbidden. She solves problems that the protagonists don't even know that they have. And then she leaves. Will she come back? She'll come back if she's needed. What's appealing about that, and the fact that we've seen this story in literature, in the Disney film, in this new film, in several other arenas over the course of almost 100 years ago. The first notions of Mary Poppins occurred to P.L. Travers. So that was how we structured the book. We begin on the east wind with Mary Poppins arriving, and in this case it's Mary Poppins arriving in a new film. And then we take people through the various creative influences of Poppins, from P.L. Travers to Disney, to the phenomenon that happened after the Disney film, to the perpetual presence of Mary Poppins in culture and popular culture since then. It's really a candy box of a book, in the sense that there's not a linear narrative. There are a ton of guest essays. I went to, once again, go to people smarter than you. I went to a lot of people that I know who are thoughtful and scholarly and educated about aspects of Mary Poppins. So the book is filled with essentially guest essays. Everyone from Brian Sibley to Cameron McIntosh to Paula Sigmund Lowry, people that Disney fans will recognize, who have written very specific and in very many cases unusual aspects of the Mary Poppins character, the Mary Poppins history. And of course, visuals throughout. Amazing visuals from the new film, from the Disney film, from archives and collections and photography from all over the world. So I think that it will be, once again, looking at that audience that I do, as I said, for books. I have to hit the 15-year-old who's never actually seen Mary Poppins and the 90-year-old who has grown up with Mary Poppins, and make them all feel like they've gotten something very satisfying out of what we've put together in Practically Poppins in every way.
Jeff Kurtti, thank you so much for being on Dreamfinders. It's been a wonderful time having you.
Anytime. I appreciate the conversation, and I hope your listeners enjoy it.
And that's it for this episode of Dreamfinders. I'd like to thank Jeff Kurtti for being my guest. Be sure to purchase his newest books such as Travels with Walt Disney and Practically Poppins in Every Way at your local bookseller or Amazon. Our podcast artwork is provided by J.P. Tanner. Find his other work at tanwoodcreative.com. This podcast is distributed by WDW News Today, the worldwide leader in Disney Parks news. Read all they have to offer at WDWNT.com. Dreamfinders is hosted and produced by yours truly, Nathan Hartman, who you can follow on Twitter at SomeStuffISaid. Tell your friends about the show, and please give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Also, if you or someone you know would make a great guest on the program, feel free to email us at dreamfinders@wdwnt.com. I'm Nathan Hartman, and remember, if we can dream it, then we can do it.